The council of Wendmoor had never once called a man into the square to shame him, but on the gray morning the fen mist still clung to the chalk. That is exactly what they did to Ottar the miller. He stood broad and unmoving before the low stone bench where the elders sat, his sandy hair cropped close, his beard trimmed neat, his sleeves rolled past, forearms that 20 years of turning stone had dusted permanently pale. Beside him, taller than any elder and impossible to ignore, stood the reason they had summoned him. She was an orc woman with skin, the deep living green of River Reed Inn. High summer, silver-white curls loose to her shoulders, and violet-gray eyes that met each elder in turn and did not drop. Dagny, who held the grain of half the valley in her ledgers, spoke for all of them. "Send her back across the slake by nightfall," she said, "or forfeit your seat on this council and everything that seat has ever protected for you." And out in the fen, moving toward the stone causeway even as they argued, came the people who had already marked this woman as a thing to be claimed. Her name was Vashka, and she had walked out of the marsh 11 days before, with silt to her thighs and a weir-keeper's iron hook still lashed across her back. To understand why the elders feared her, you have to understand the water she came from. South of the slake, where the land gives up being land and becomes a shifting country of reed and silt and salt tide, the orcs live in what they call tide houses. Each house is a ring of raised timber halls built behind a great earthen weir, and the weir is the whole of their fortune because it holds the killing salt out of the freshwater beds where their food grows. When a house keeps its weir, it thrives. When a house lets its weir fail and the salt comes in over the beds, its people are named unsalted, which means landless, which means claimable. A stronger house may then come with a claim iron and bind the survivors to rebuild under a new name. And the most prized claim of all is a weir-keeper, because a weir-keeper can read the way water wants to move through stone. Vashka had been the keeper of a house called the Aneth, and she had fled rather than let herself be bound. She had not fled because her house failed by accident. She had fled because it failed on purpose. The neighboring house, whose claim captain was a broad, gray-eyed orc named Sarkoth, had wanted the Aneth beds for 2 seasons, and one moonless night, Min of his house had cut the Aneth weir low so the tide would ruin it. By dawn, the salt was in the beds and the Aneth were unsalted, and Sarkoth stood ready with the iron to claim the one keeper who could rebuild what he had broken. Vashka had put her hook across her back and walked north through water no unmarked traveler would risk, following the only rumor she had, which was that on the chalk above the fen there lived a miller who fed anyone who came hungry to his door. That rumor was the second thing you need to understand about Ottar, and it will matter later more than any speech he ever gave. She could not simply vanish north and be safe, and that truth pressed on every day she spent on the chalk. A weir-keeper carries her rank openly, notched into the shaft of the iron hook every keeper is given, and any orc of the tide houses can read those notches at a glance the way a soldier reads a rank. Vashka could no more hide what she was than she could scrub the green from her skin. Worse, the salt binding gave a claim, captain a season and a day to press his iron before the claim went stale. And Sarkoth had followed the fouled salt line of her passage north, patient as a man who knew the law was still his. Every morning she woke on the shelf was a morning nearer the day his claim would be answered or lost. The mill sat where the village ended and the drop began. Wendmoor perched on a shelf of white chalk above the hole. Gray sweep of the fen, and at the lip of that shelf a stream had been coaxed long ago into a narrow channel the villagers called the Leat. The Leat ran level along the top of the chalk, then dropped hard over. The wheel turned it and spilled back down into the marsh below. Everything Ottar owned depended on that channel of water, and everything about that channel of water depended on the council, because it was the council that granted the water right, the council that said how much of the stream the mill could take before the crofts downhill got their share, and the council that decided each spring who ground the valley's grain. For 20 years the answer had been the mill on the chalk, and the man who held the seat that guaranteed it was Ottar himself. Dagny had made the threat with precision. Lose the seat, and she would move the valley's grain to the newer mill, 4 bends downriver, revoke the mill's full draw of the leat, and drop the whole cost of the failing flood weir onto whatever single household the council no longer had reason to protect. That failing weir was the fear under everything in Wendmoor, though no elder liked to say it aloud in front of a stranger. The village kept its own earthen weir at the foot of the causeway, and it held back the fens. Spring flood from the lower crofts and from the one stone road that connected the shelf to dry ground beyond. For 3 years it had leaked worse each season. 2 winters back, the water had come up over the causeway stones and cut the village off for 9 days, and the memory of those 9 days sat behind every hard word Dagny spoke. So when a weir-keeper walked out of the marsh and asked for bread, some part of Wendmoor should have wept. With relief, instead, the elders saw only the shape of the trouble behind her, and trouble, to a frightened village, always looks greener than help. Ottar had taken her in without asking the council first, and that was the true reason. For the square, he had to have it the whole valley knew and half the valley depended on, every 7th day. Whatever the mill had ground, he set aside a portion and baked it into plain loaves and left them on the broad stone by the mill door for anyone who could not pay. The dole loaf, they called it. Widows took it, and the crofters, after a bad harvest, and once a whole winter of children whose fathers had drowned reboarding the weir. He had done it so long that nobody thanked him for it anymore, which was exactly how he preferred a kindness to sit. When Vashka came up the leap path, gaunt and salt-scoured, he did not weigh whether she was a person the village would approve of. He handed her a loaf off the stone, and then a second, and watched a grown woman who had walked 40 miles through poison water decide whether it was safe to eat. His apprentice watched too. Tove was 14, quick, and had come to the mill 2 years earlier because her mother could not feed all 6 of her children, and Ottar could use the hands. She had expected to be frightened of the orc. Instead, she found herself, within 3 days, standing at the edge of the leat while Vashka crouched over the sluice gates with her long, green fingers spread flat on the wet timber, feeling the water through the wood, the way Tove's grandmother used to feel a fever through a wrist. The mill's leat had a sickness Ottar had lived with for years and never named. Somewhere below the wheel, the channel was silting, and every month he lost a little more of his fall, a little more of his power to turn stone. Vashka named it in an afternoon. Then she began, without being asked, to fix it. But a village does not forgive a man for feeding the wrong mouth, just because that mouth turns out to be useful. Word of the orc at the mill crossed the shelf in a day, and by the 3rd day, Dagny had counted her votes. She was not a cruel woman, and that is important because the story would be smaller if she were. She had buried a husband and a brother to the fen. She carried the grain credit of 40 households in her head, and she had decided long ago that Wendmoor survived by giving the marsh nothing it could grab and hold. An orc under the mill roof was, to her, an open door in a flood wall. She did not hate Vashka. She simply could not afford her. The smith, Bram, sat on the council too, and Bram was the man Ottar had thought he could count on. They had grown up throwing stones into the same fen. Bram had shod the mill's cart horse for cost, more times than either could remember, and when the leat froze one brutal winter, it was Bram's forge that thawed the gate iron. So when the council first met over the matter, quietly, before the square, Ottar looked to Bram for the vote that would let the woman stay. Bram looked at his own hands and said that his forge took its charcoal on credit from Dagny's ledger, and that his wife was carrying their first child, and that he was sorry. He did not vote against Ottar. He simply did not vote at all, and an absent vote, when the count is close, weighs the same as a blade. That was how it came to the public order. Dagny had wanted it public because public was harder to take back. She laid the choice out plainly so every soul in Wendmoor would witness it. Ottar could keep his seat, his water right, his contract, and his place among them, and all he had to do was walk the orc woman back down to the causeway and send her across the slick into the marsh, alone, on foot, at dusk, with Sarkoth's claimants somewhere in the reeds. Or he could keep the woman and lose all the rest. Ottar was not a clever speaker, and this is the first Replace the story, refuses the easy path. He did not answer with a ringing speech that shamed the elders into weeping. He stood in the square a long time, long enough that the silence became its own kind of pressure, and then he said only that he had fed hungry people off that stone for 20 years and had never once first asked them what they were. He said a seat on a bench was a small thing to set against the life. And then he took off the carved elder's token that marked his place on the council, set it on the stone bench in front of Dagny, and walked back up the leap path to his mill with the green-skinned woman beside him. He had made his choice in under a minute, and the cost of it began the same hour. By evening, Dagny had done everything she promised, and done it fast, because she too understood that mercy delayed is mercy that spreads. A rider went down the valley to the newer mill, and the season's grain contract went with him. Word came up the path that the mill on the chalk was to draw no more than a third of the leat until the water right was reassigned, which for a wheel already starved of fall was close to a death sentence. And a levy notice was tacked to the mill door in Dagny's own careful hand, naming Ottar's household as the party, now responsible for the repair of the village flood weir, a cost no single family in Wendmoor could ever hope to carry. In one evening, the richest working man on the shelf had become the poorest, and Vashka stood in the doorway and understood fully what her bread had cost him. The cost did not stop at his own door, and that was the part Dagny had counted on. Tov's mother came up the path the next day, wringing a corner of her apron to say that Dagny had let it be known that any household still tied to the outlawed mill might find its own winter grain credit reviewed, and that with 5 other children to feed, she could not risk it, and that Tove would have to come home. She said it with tears on her face, a mother doing sums with too few numbers. Tove refused to go and stood in the mill yard with her chin up while her mother wept, and that small mutiny was the first crack in Dagny's arithmetic, though no one saw it yet. There was a date under all of it now. The council had given Ottar until the turn of the moon, 12 days off, to send the woman across the slake or see the levy enforced to the last coin, which meant the wheel sold out from under him for a weir he had never been asked to break. She did not weep or make him promises. She went back to the leat, where Tove had watched her feel the water through the timber. Now the whole failing shape of Wendmoor's trouble had come clear to her, and it was all one trouble. The silting leat and the leaking flood weir and the drowned causeway were the same water misread by people who had never learned to read it. Ottar's stream and the village's weir were fed by the same rising spring under the chalk, and the fen had been slowly winning the argument between them for 3 years because no one had known how to answer it. Vashka knew how to answer it. She had spent her life answering exactly this, on a larger and deadlier scale, in the tied houses of the Aneth. Over the next days she began, with Tove hauling stone and Ottar hauling timber, to remake the sluice at the head of the leat so that the mill and the weir could share the spring instead of starving each other. It was slow, filthy, unglamorous work, and it changed one mind at a time. The two of them fell into a rhythm across those days that neither would have called anything so soft as friendship. Not out loud. Ottar rose before light to bank the mill fire, and by the time he came out to the sluice, she was already there, steam off the water and her cream cloak dark with wet at the hem, and they would work. An hour before either spoke a full sentence. In the evenings, Tove sat between them at the plank table while Vashka drew the shape of the hidden spring in spilled flour, and Ottar, who had eaten alone at that table for 11 years since his own family scattered down the valley, found the room louder and warmer than he remembered a room being. He simply started baking a 3rd loaf. The first mind it changed belonged to a crofter named Seifa, whose lower field had gone under twice in 3 years, and who came up to shout at Ottar for harboring the marsh, and stay to watch a green-handed stranger show her exactly why her field flooded and exactly how to stop it. Seifa went home and told her neighbors, and the neighbors came up under the excuse of curiosity, and some of them remembered the dole loaf while they stood there. And the loyalty Ottar had built one Sunday at a time began, quietly, to come due. But minds change slower than water rises, and the danger Vashka had brought north was no longer somewhere in the reeds. It was at the causeway. Sarkoth came on the 9th day after the square, at low light, with 6 of his claimants and the claim iron slung across his back, the way Vashka carried her hook. They did not come as an army, because the salt binding was not a war. It was a claim, and a claim has its own cruel manners. They came to the foot of the causeway, planted the iron upright in the mud where the stone road met the marsh, and called across the water for the village to surrender the unsalted keeper of the Aneth, who was theirs to bind by the law of the tide houses. They were tall, gray-hided against Vashka's living green, and they carried the long-hooped poles the marsh orcs used to move stone and drag boats. And in the hands of angry people, those poles were plainly something worse. Their arrival did a thing Dagny's letters never could. It made the danger real. Standing on Wendmoor's own stone and a real danger on your doorstep is a different animal from a rumor in the reeds. Nor did it stay only a matter of words shouted over water. When 2 crofters went down to the causeway to tell the strangers to take their iron and go, one of Sarkoth's claimants set the butt of his hooked pole against the older man's chest and walked him backward off the causeway stones into the shallows, unhurried, to show the village exactly how little their voices weighed against a marsh orc's reach. The crofter came up the shelf soaked and shaking, more from fury than cold, a long scrape down his forearm where the hook had caught. It was no wound worth a bandage, but it was worth far more than that, because now a Wendmoor man had bled. On Wendmoor stone, at the hand of the people Dagny wanted to appease, and there is a kind of insult. A village will swallow and a kind it will not, and no ledger in the valley could tell Dagny which was which. The council, minus its miller, met in a panic, and Dagny made the argument that must have felt to her like simple arithmetic. Give the marsh the woman, and the marsh goes home. 6 armed orcs at the causeway against a village of millers. And crofters was a sum with only one safe answer. She was not entirely wrong, and the story is honest about that too. If Wendmoor handed Vashka over, Sarkoth would almost certainly take his prize and leave, and the levy and the water right could quietly be given back, and the 9 terrible days of the last flood need never come again. Half the village wanted exactly that, and said so, and some of them said it to Ottar's face at his own door. He did not have a good answer for the arithmetic, and he did not pretend to. What he had was Tove, who stood in the mill doorway with flour on her arms and said that the orc woman had spent 9 days teaching her to read water and had never once asked to be thanked, and that if Wendmoor was the kind of place that sold a guest to raiders to save on a repair bill, then she did not want to grow up here. A 14-year-old's speech should not move a council, and it did not by itself. But Bram was standing in that doorway too, come up at last to say what he had failed to say before, and Bram heard the girl, and Bram was ashamed. And shame in a decent man is a slow fuse that eventually reaches something. Sarkoth did not wait politely at the causeway for the village to argue. On the 2nd night his claimants went to work on the one thing that would force Wendmoor's hand faster than any threat, which was the very water Vashka had been mending. They knew weirs. They cut into the head of the village flood weir in the dark, the same trick that had drowned the Aneth beds, meaning to bring the spring flood up over the crofts and the causeway, and make the village so desperate for relief that it would trade a stranger to get it. It was a claim captain's logic, and it very nearly worked. By dawn the lower field, Sepha's field, had a silver skin of tide across it, and the water was climbing the causeway stones, and the mill's leat, robbed and fouled at once, slowed until the great wheel groaned and nearly stopped. Vashka stood at the sluice she had half rebuilt, and watched everything she had promised, these people start to fail in front of them, put there deliberately by the man who had drowned her home once already. Here is where a lesser story would give Ottar a sword and Sarkoth a duel, and be done. Wendmoor's answer was made of smaller, truer things, and it needed more than one pair of hands. Vashka understood the cut weir in a glance, because she had seen the same wound in the Aneth, and she knew it could still be answered if the leat and the sluice were used the way she had been rebuilding them to be used. But she could not open the upper gate, drop the spillway, and hold the beam alone against that weight of water. She needed the village. And the village, standing on its flooding shelf at dawn, had to decide in the space of an hour whether the green-handed stranger was the flood or the answer to it. They chose, and not because of a speech. Sepha chose first, wading up from her drowned field with a spade because she had seen with her own eyes what this woman knew. Then the widows who had eaten off the dolestone for years chose, and the crofters whose fathers Vashka had never met, but whose bread had come from that same door, and they came up the leap path in, the gray light with poles and spades and sacks, and stood waiting to be told what to do by an orc. Vashka told them. She set them on the spillway beam, a dozen hands, green and pale together, and had them drop. The upper sluice on her count, so the mill's whole hoard of water dumped down the mended channel and struck the fen below the cut weir instead of above it, throwing the rising tide back on itself long enough to matter. She put Tove at the gate iron because the girl had learned the feel of it. She put Bram and his smiths back on the main beam because it was the heaviest work, and Bram, for the first time in the whole affair, did not look at his hands before he acted. Sarkoth came up the causeway when he saw his flood being turned, because a claim captain cannot stand and watch his weapon fail, and this is where Ottar met him, not with a blade, and not with a duel, but with the mill itself. Ottar knew his lead the way Vashka knew a tide. He waited until Sarkoth and two claimants were on the narrow stone lip where the channel ran hard beside the causeway, and then he threw the lower sluice he had opened and closed 10,000 times, and the mill's full spilled draw came across the lip in a cold gray sheet and took the footing out from under 3 heavy orcs at once. It did not kill them. It put them off their feet in fast water below their own drowning flood, hooks and iron, and all, and it held them there struggling while the village worked above. A weir-keeper on dry stone is a fearsome thing. A claim captain floundering waist-deep in a miller's tail race is only a wet man, and every crofter on that beam saw it. The claim broke, in the end, not because Sarkoth was beaten in the water, though he was, but because of a thing the marsh orcs' own law made possible, and Vashka was quick enough to seize. The salt binding could only claim the unsalted, the landless. Those a house could take, because no other house would hold them. So while Sarkoth hauled himself dripping onto the stone and reached for the claim iron he had planted in Wendmoor's mud, Vashka did the one thing that turned his own law against him. She asked the village, out loud, in front of him and all of them, to take her in, not to shelter her, to hold her, in their word and their custom, as one of their own, salted to their ground, a keeper of Wendmoor's, weir and no one's unsalted prize. And Wendmoor, standing green-handed and pale-handed together on the beam they had just saved, answered yes, one voice after another, until the yes was the whole shelf. A house cannot claim what another people has already held. Sarkoth had come with an iron for a landless woman, and there was no landless woman left on the chalk to take. The law that had drowned her home had run out of anything to grip. He knew it. That is the last thing. About the marsh orcs' law worth saying, it was a hard law, but it was a law, and Sarkoth had built his whole life inside it. Standing wet on the causeway with his claim dissolved by a word he could not argue against, in front of a village that had chosen and would not unchoose, he did the only thing his own custom left him. He pulled the claim iron out of Wendmoor's mud, which under the salt binding meant the claim was withdrawn, and he took his 6 and went back down into the fen. There was no last speech and no last blow. There was a defeated man obeying the rules of a game he had lost, walking away over the same causeway the village had just kept from drowning. They spent the whole of that day fixing what he had cut, and it was in the fixing that Wendmoor's fortune actually turned, because now the village finally let Vashka finish what she had started at the sluice. By dusk, the flood weir was not merely patched, but rebuilt to a keeper's design, sharing the chalk spring honestly between the crofts and the mill, and the great wheel on the shelf turned faster and truer than Ottar had felt it turn in a decade of slow silting. The thing that had made him poor by evening 10 days before now made him the only miller in the valley, whose water would hold through any flood the fen could raise, and Dagny's arithmetic quietly turned over in her hands. The newer mill downriver sat in the flood path she had just watched. Wendmoor master. The valley's grain, if it wanted to be dry, had one safe wheel now, and it stood on the chalk. Dagny came up the leap path the next morning, alone. And this too the story keeps small and honest. She did not weep or beg pardon. She was a woman who had spent 40 years keeping a frightened village alive by giving the marsh nothing, and she had been, by her own hard measure, wrong about which stranger was the flood. She set the carved elder's token back on the broad stone by the mill door, next to that day's dole loaf, and said the seat was Ottar's if he wanted it, and the water right and contract. Came back with it. Ottar looked at the token a long while, then he left it lying on the stone, beside the bread, and said the village should give the seat to the person who had actually read the water. If the village had the sense, the last 10 days should have taught it. Whether the village ever seated a green-skinned keeper is a tale for another evening. What is certain is that from that spring, the dole stone by the mill door held 2 things every 7th day, a loaf and a second smaller flatbread pressed the way the tide houses made it, set out by a woman with river-reed skin and silver-white curls for anyone on the shelf who came hungry and did not yet know they were already held. If you have felt anything at all standing in that mill doorway with the flower and the flood and the 2 people who chose each other over everything safe, then you already belong here. This is Orkbond Saga, where the green-skinned and the human meet in the hardest hours and decide, again and again, to hold on. Tap the like and follow the channel so the next story finds you when the mist is up and the fin is rising. Ring the reminder and tell me in the comments what you would have said on that. Stone bench, the seat or the life. Stay with me and I will bring you deeper into the marsh next time.